In recent years, the term incel has been increasingly used in academic research and public discourse as a way to explain political violence, extremism, and public safety risks. In this framing, incels are no longer just an online subculture or a small group of socially isolated men, but a broader category of grievance that researchers believe may matter far beyond those who actually identify with the label. This is an intentionally long video lecture here. And I did it this way to give you the full context about how research is done, how it's written, and ultimately published in what should be reputable professional journals. Feel free to check the video chapters and skip around if that's helpful for you. For those of you with research backgrounds, you'll understand exactly the issues that I'm discussing. For others, be assured that I'll put up a lot of images to help you follow along. In the newly published research paper that I'm covering here, the author defines incel not as a demographic or behavioral condition, but as an ideological worldview derived from the idea of involuntary celibacy. I'll put a link to the original article and measures in the video description so you can download them and see it all for yourself. Importantly, respondents in this study did not need to be celibate, romantically unsuccessful, or identify as incels at all. What mattered to the author was whether they endorse certain beliefs about women, dating, entitlement, and social justice. Using survey data from U.S. men, the author argued that what he believes are incel-related opinions are associated with greater support for political violence, and that this relationship is explained through factors like masculinity stress, aggression, hostility toward outgroups, and illiberal political attitudes. We'll get into that definition here as well. The author presents these findings as relevant not just for theory, but for how institutions understand and respond to political extremism. Again, this video is long. It's a methodological walkthrough of how these ideas are actually measured, what the descriptive results look like, and how much weight they can reasonably support. I'm not going to teach stats or walk through mediation diagrams in this video, but I am going to slow down the assumptions that the author makes and show how all of his data measures are inadequate and misused. Because once research like this leaves academia, those assumptions don't just stay theoretical.
It's time to all choose your timeline on the roller coaster of life.
This is Dr. James Piazza, current professor of political science at Penn State University. He holds a PhD in politics from New York University, a master's degree in Middle East Studies from the University of Michigan, and a bachelor's degree in political science from Loyola University, Chicago. His research and teaching interests center on terrorism, political violence and violent extremism, U.S. and global security issues, political behavior, illiberal attitudes, and polarization. He has over 60 peer-reviewed articles in reputable journals in political science, security studies, and comparative politics. In the 2025 article that I'm reviewing here, Piazza argues that certain anger-driven beliefs among men, including ideas associated with incel ideology, are linked to greater support for political violence. He uses survey data from U.S. men to test whether factors like masculinity stress, aggression, resentment toward outgroups, and illiberal attitudes help explain that relationship. His paper presents these findings as relevant not just for academic theory, but for understanding political extremism and political public safety risks. What started for me as a research paper review and how the author determined who is an incel based on made-up questions turned into a full dive into how the full study was done, and that's what we're doing here. So coming up, I'll spend considerable time showing that Piazza is explicitly arguing that beliefs associated with incel ideology are linked to higher support for political violence, outgroup hostility, and related attitudes. What matters here is how he defines incel. Piazza does not require that respondents actually be celibate, sexually inactive, or unable to form relationships. Instead, He treats incel as an ideological belief system, a way of interpreting frustration and perceived unfairness, rather than demographic or behavioral condition. With that framing in mind, let's start looking at the survey measures that Piazza used in his study, starting with support for political violence. Because before we can talk about explanations or implications of his study, we have to understand what guys in the study were asked, how the scales work, and what the basic results look like. So I'm going to start with the abstract political violence measure because this is the primary outcome that the rest of this paper is built on. Again, I'll be putting up a lot of overlays and images here to help you follow along. The political violence support abstract measure assesses general willingness to endorse political violence in the abstract, that is, without reference to specific situations or real-world incidents. And you can see it here on the screen. Piazza uses this measure to evaluate openness to political violence. And men in his study, who averaged age 49, reported low endorsement of political violence with an average score of about 18 on a scale that could range from 8 to 40, and it had a median response rate of about 15. That means that more than half of the sample fell closer to the rejection than approval of this measure. The histogram shown here is strongly left skewed, showing a large pileup at the lowest scores and a long right tail, which indicates that strong support for political violence was uncommon. Although the individual items come from earlier work, the measure itself is original to this study, making it a newly constructed composite rather than a previously validated instrument. What Piazza actually did was take 4 of the items from one measure, 2 from another, 1 from yet another measure, and 1 that he made up himself. Piazza broadens it, he adds 1 constraint question, and ends up with a new, untested measure of violence. So he combines older tools for his newly constructed one, rather than relying on a single established instrument. And this will be a common theme as we continue to dissect Piazza's research. Next in the study, the political violence support specific measure assesses perceived justification and sympathy toward concrete, dramatized acts of specific partisan violence. Piazza includes this measure to address beliefs that abstract questions may overstate support for political violence when context is added. He's trying to be more specific with views of political violence. Here, support for specific political violence was low, again, with a mean of about 8.8 and a median of 8, which could range from 4 to 20. This indicates that most respondents rejected the violent scenarios, with the distribution, again, skewed toward low scores, shown here, and relatively few respondents expressing strong support or approval of these questions. As we can see in this histogram, responders overwhelmingly scored these actions as not being justified. And here's another major critique I want to make, which is consistent again throughout this study. Piazza's work does not provide a formal justification for this measure's development and use beyond placing it in the broader discussion and citing prior work as inspiration. That is, justification for its development appears only at the conceptual level, not at the psychometric or item construction level. In the methods section of his paper, Piazza explains that there is an active debate about whether abstract measures inflate support for political violence. He mentions that prior research showing responses differing when violence is contextualized, and he acknowledges best practice is therefore to include both abstract and specific measures. Those are the 2 we've covered so far. But that's not how solid research is conducted. In quality peer-reviewed research, a measure is not just written and used. It is built and tested in stages. Again, if you didn't catch it, if I didn't already mention it, Piazza made this one up and put it straight in his study and published it with no testing. Researchers usually start by defining the concept clearly, then generate questions based on theory and prior studies, and then they refine them through expert reviews and pilot testing to make sure that the questions mean what they are supposed to mean. Before using the measure in a study and publishing it, researchers typically test whether the items in a questionnaire group together statistically, that's where we get the reliability, and whether it all captures the intended concept rather than something else. That's where we get the validity. When people like Piazza skip those steps when they ask questions in a study, we have less assurance that it's measuring what the authors, in this case Piazza, what he claims it is. That's why people do multiple preliminary tests using factor analysis, path analysis, and other tests to validate the questions that they're asking. And here, I also want to point out some glaring issues with Piazza's made-up measure about political violence. You can see them here on the screen. First, his use of political rally versus gathering rally. Political rally describes a clear, conventional political event. Meanwhile, gathering rally blurs whether the event is formally political or just politically themed. And that matters because calling something a political rally more strongly activates political identity, partisan threat, and ideological justification frames. Whereas gathering rally softens that cue and makes the violence feel more interpersonal than political. Second, punching versus hitting. Punching is more vivid, specific, and perceptually violent. It implies fists, intent, and physical aggression outright. Hitting, on the other hand, is broader and less graphic. It can range from anything like a shove to an outright punch. This small difference lowers the perceived severity of the second act relative to the first, even though both are legally described as assault. And that can reduce moral condemnation and increase expressed sympathy in survey responses. And third, partisan target asymmetry combined with softened language. So in Piazza's made-up survey items, the Republicans are paired with the stronger political framing, political rally, and the more violent verb, punching. While the Democrats, in his example, or his question, are paired with the weaker political framing of gathering rally and the softer verb of hitting. This creates an imbalance such that violence against Republicans is framed as more overtly political and more physically aggressive than violence against Democrats. So, actions by Democrats is perceived as having to be more aggressive to qualify as violent. Taken together, these wording differences introduce many measurement biases, and they make the two scenarios inequivalent in perceived political intensity or violence severity, which means differences in responses would reflect wording effects rather than genuine differences in attitudes toward partisan violence. In a measure meant to compare support or sympathy across partisan respondents, that irregularity weakens internal validity and makes interpretation far less clean. And now we get into what got me really heated when I first came across this paper, and why I went from just a simple paper review to this in-depth analysis of Piazza's work. And that's Piazza's approach to defining incels and assigning what I think are his own ideological beliefs to those men. Piazza used these questions as a primary variable to link gender-related grievances to approval of political violence. And let me be explicitly clear here. According to Dr. James Piazza, if you agree with these statements, you are more inclined to agree with and participate in political violence. That is his ultimate thesis in this study. So this incel belief scale had a mean score of about 26.5 on a scale that ranges from 9 to 45, with a median of 27, placing the typical respondent near the middle of the scale, again, as we can see on the screen. The distribution, as you can see, is symmetrically bell-shaped, suggesting that extreme endorsement or complete rejection of incel beliefs, as he calls them, was less common than moderate agreement or even ambivalence. Again, let me be clear here. What this scale is not doing is identifying incels at all. It's creating them by classifying a wide range of common male beliefs as incel ideology. Because the distribution of scores is bell-shaped and centered near the middle, this measure does not isolate a fringe group with extreme views. It captures ordinary men who agree with some combination of widely held perceptions about dating, attractiveness, feminism, and men's challenges. After your beliefs are lumped together as so-called incel beliefs, agreeing with them doesn't mean you're an incel. It means Piazza is labeling you one based on his own ideology of what incels are, again, by his own made-up questions in this survey. In effect, Piazza's measure quietly converts normal variation in male attitudes into evidence of incel identity, and then treats moving along that continuum as movement toward political violence. That is not measurement of a group. It is a moral reclassification through scale construction. Now, before I dig into the professionalism of the measure itself, let me just point out that many of the statements are actually true. Again, look at them on the screen here. For example, what about this question? A man's looks, not his character, determine how successful he will be in getting a girlfriend or a wife. According to Piazza, higher agreement with that statement ultimately indicates higher propensity for political violence. But on dating apps and first encounters, looks drive attention, swipes, replies, and first dates. If you're below average looking, you'll face more friction getting initial interest. And grooming, fitness, posture, style, and health all are factors of looks which signal discipline, self-respect, agency, all of which women often read as attractive character traits. Yet, Piazza totally ignores these factors with a blanket statement about men's success relative to looks alone, without even describing what looks mean. I'll skip the other statements in this measure, but again, have a close look here and tell me in the comments which ones are actually true, and therefore, as he contends, predict your propensity toward political violence. Back to the flaws of using these baseless statements in research. Piazza's reason for these questions is conceptual rather than methodological in the professional scale development process. Here's exactly what he does and does not justify. To be as fair as I can, what justification Piazza does give is first, conceptual grounding in prior literature. He states that the items are derived from recurring themes identified in prior qualitative and theoretical research on incel ideology. He cites work by several researchers as establishing a shared ideological core regarding sexual marketplace, a hierarchy between the sexes, feminism as causal blame, entitlement to sex, perceived male marginalization, and also distrust of women's fidelity. In other words, the justification is these beliefs appear consistently in the literature describing incel ideology, so I operationalized them as survey items. That's what he did. And this is a content validity argument, not a psychometric one. Second, Piazza gives item by item thematic coverage, and by that I mean each item maps onto one of the core incel claims that he makes in the theory section of his paper. And that includes sexual orientation, feminism and cultural harm topics, female hypergamy, and infidelity. So he uses all of those as context for coming up with his items. And this shows theoretical coverage, not ad hoc item writing. And the third thing that I need to give him a little bit of justification for is that his items show internal consistency. For some of you, this won't matter, but he gives us a Cronbach's alpha of 0.8922, which shows that his items, statistically, they justify offering or treating these items as a single index. And there's a little bit of solid evidence that maybe it's okay to do that. It tells us that the items measure similar things, but we don't know that it's measuring the validity part. That is what it's supposed to. Okay. I'll try not to get too carried away with the lessons here. But now here's what Piazza does not provide: a formal item generation process, expert review or cognitive interviewing. There was no pilot testing or item refinement, no factor analysis, whether exploratory or confirmatory. There was no justification for equal weighting of items. There was no testing for subdimensions within what he calls incel ideology. And there's no evidence of convergent or discriminant validity. So again, although he did a little bit of background, the point I want to do and make here is that he made them up, did no testing of them, collected data, and a journal published it. There is no justification for phrasing choices, and all of these should have been tested before asking them. So the Incel belief scale is a made-up index developed by Piazza based on themes that he repeatedly found in research about Incel literature. Moving on to the next measure in Piazza's study, the masculine gender stress scale measures how stressful men find situations that threaten traditional masculine status, competence, or identity. As always, I'll put these up here and the results is on the screen for you. Piazza includes this measure to test whether stress about living up to expectations of being a man helps explain the relationship between incel beliefs and violent attitudes. Here, scores averaged about 28.6 on a scale that could range from 15 to 60, and he gives a median of 27. This indicates generally low to moderate stress levels in the sample. As with previous measures in the study, the distribution of his results are skewed to the left side, meaning that most men reported relatively low stress in these situations, with a few of them reporting high stress. And this is only one of, I think, 2 measures in Piazza's study that is not clearly overreaching. This measure has a long history, a clear theoretical grounding, and has been tested and refined across multiple research programs. Unlike the Incel belief scale that we reviewed a moment ago, or the author-written measures elsewhere in his paper, this one reflects real measurement work rather than ad hoc construction. So I don't have a major issue with this one in and of itself. The issue for me is how much credit Piazza gives it relative to how he defines incels and his claim that those men are more prone to political violence. Piazza also measured aggression as tendencies toward anger, irritability, and readiness to respond aggressively when provoked. This one here was used to determine whether general aggressive tendencies help account for support for political violence. As shown here, these scores clustered near the midpoint, with a mean of about 11.5 on a scale that could range 4 to 20, with a median of 11. This tells us that most respondents endorsed mild or occasional aggressive tendencies rather than extreme aggression, with scores, again, spread fairly evenly around the center of this curve here. This is a commonly used aggression measure, and Piazza, I think, uses it appropriately. Again, so I don't have a major problem with it, so I'm not going to spend much time here. What matters is how this measure is used, again, in Piazza's full model, in his full study. He positions aggression as one of several pathways through which, again, incel beliefs are translated into greater support for political violence. In other words, once men are classified as holding incel beliefs as he describes them, their aggression scores are then used to explain why some of those men are more open to being political violent or accepting it. For me, the problem isn't the measure. Again, it's how Piazza makes that connection. Next in Piazza's model is outgroup hate, which measures resentment toward minority groups and equality claims, framed as perceptions that minority rights are excessive and demanding. He included this one in his study to examine whether hostility toward outgroups contributes to political violence attitudes. So for this one, the outgroup hate measure had a mean of about 6.1 and a median of 6 on scores that could range from 2 to 10, placing the typical respondent near the middle. Again, you can see the items on the image here. The distribution is relatively flat, indicating a wide range of views on minority rights and equality claims rather than strong consensus in either direction. As bad as the incel measure is, this outgroup hate measure may be the weakest and thinnest in Piazza's model from a measurement standpoint. The measure consists of only 2 author-written items, again, ones that he made up and didn't test, and those are, we are too concerned about protecting minority rights, and members of other racial, religious, or minority groups are too demanding in their push for equal rights. There is no claim that this is a validated subgroup hate scale. The only justification, again, that Piazza gives is that it's theoretical, like his measure that we talked about before. Critically, none of the background theory is tied to specific measurement tradition for these 2 items. He does not cite any prior scales from which they were drawn, nor does he describe them as a shortened version of an existing instrument. Instead, the implicit logic is, I think these items indicate resentment toward outgroups, which theory links to liberalism and, to illiberalism and political violence. That's it. There's no methodological defense for using only 2 items, which is very, very subprofessional. There's no defense for treating resentment about minority rights as equivalent to outgroup hate. There's no collapsing racial, religious, and other minorities into a single undifferentiated target. There's also no distinguishing of outgroup hostility from policy disagreement. And there's no separating affective dislike from ideological opposition. And I know I'm being very thorough here, but that's for a reason. I want to get it all out here. He also does not test dimensionality, measurement invariance, overlap with other constructs like being conservative or zero-sum beliefs. And here's why all of this is a problem. 2-item measures can be acceptable when the construct is very narrow and concrete, or the items are near identical indicators of a single attitude. But that's not the case here. These items tap grievance framing, perceptions of rights overreach, and resentment toward equality. Those items are related to outgroup hostility, but they are not the same as dehumanization, moral exclusion, temperament, or genuine hate or hostility toward other people. And as you can see here, the last measure that Piazza uses is political illiberalism, which assesses how open people are to giving up democratic rules when politics feel broken. Piazza included this one to test whether anti-democratic narratives are associated with support for political violence. At a basic level, illiberalism means rejection of core liberal democratic norms, even if someone still participates in elections or supports democracy in name. Scores for this measure averaged about 4.6 with a median of 3 on a scale that ranges 2 to 10. This indicates, as with previous measures, that most respondents rejected the strongman or military rule scenarios that he gives. As with previous measures, the distribution here is heavily skewed to lower scores, meaning support for clearly illiberal governance is uncommon and concentrated in only a small minority of respondents. My issue here is that the only 2 items are extreme by design. As such, it does not distinguish motivations like fear, anger, efficiency, or resentment, and it does not capture softer liberal attitudes like court picking, speech limits, or minority suppression, and therefore should not be treated as a full illiberal worldview. Listen, I know that was a lot to digest for those of you who soaked it all up. I hope that this is giving all of you a lesson on what's being published in academic literature with an understanding of how professors are making their mark on today's masculine issues. And to that end, let me offer this commentary to put it all in place for men today. Taken collectively and descriptively, Piazza's measures paint a picture that is much more muted, heterogeneous, and minority-driven than the narrative weight that he places on them. Across nearly every measure, men's responses were low to moderate, as we saw, and the variance that drives the models is coming from relatively small tails, not from broad endorsement in the men who responded to his online survey. At a descriptive level, what these data show is not men broadly supporting political violence or even incel beliefs are strongly tied to violence. Instead, it's most men reject political violence. Most men do not strongly endorse the beliefs that Piazza labels as incel beliefs. Most men report only modest masculinity stress, and only a smaller subset clusters near high levels across attitudes or beliefs. Yet, Piazza would have us believe that, overall, approximately half of men are incels, and those men have increased propensity toward either agree with or to engage in political violence. I realize that this sounds academic, but I don't know how else to state it succinctly. This is about differences within a subgroup, not prevalence or normative endorsement. And this is an important lesson, because fancy regression and mediation models, like Piazza reported in his paper, are very good at detecting fewer scores that are clustered at the higher end, even when most base scores are at the lower end. Again, I don't want to make this a stats issue, but bear with me here. Statistically, Piazza can show higher scores on one scale, predicting higher scores on another scale. Functionally, however, the descriptive distribution suggests that these are fringe responses, not central tendencies. Without acknowledging that interpretation in Piazza's data, it's easy to slide from statements like, men who believe that looks matter in a relationship, to saying, half of men are incels, and incels promote political violence. And that's what the raw data distributions simply do not support. What's also striking to me is how compressed and mid-range several of the mediator scales are. Again, you don't have to know about stats to know this. Bell-shaped men's beliefs, ordinary aggression, moderate masculinity stress, and very low liberalism suggest overlapping but very weakly defined differentiated constructions. In that context, statistically significant paths that Piazza reports may reflect shared grievance or real personal experiences rather than distinct psychological mechanisms, especially given the baselessness of his measures. So, at a holistic, descriptive level, the data look like this. A largely nonviolent, non-illiberal sample that expresses low levels of grievance, stress, resentment, and permissive attitudes toward force. That is a very different claim than one about widespread radicalization or systemic threat, and it calls for restraint in framing, especially in a policy-relevant venue. And now let's review Piazza's full study before we discuss what it means for the current research publication landscape. I'd say that the selection and use of Piazza's measures is about the equivalent of a college junior or senior doing an undergraduate capstone project. Taken collectively, his measurement strategy looks like competent, maybe late undergrad or even early graduate work. Not a senior scholar with 60 publications, with a PhD, and teaching at a leading research university in the United States. So here's my professional critique of James's research and publication. First, he relies heavily on first-generation or minimally justified measures in his data collection. 4 might be 5. 4 or 5 of the 7 measures were developed without professional measurement approaches. There's no systematic item generation, no pilot testing, no factor analysis, no dimensional checks, no evidence of anything professional. That level of effort may be acceptable for exploratory research in graduate school, but Piazza does not frame this as an exploratory study. He frames it as explanatory and policy relevant. Second, his measures show uneven rigor across his full statistical model, which is a classic indicator of low-level research. While the masculinity measure is well-validated, historically grounded, and psychometrically strong, the others, like the ones he made up, the incel beliefs, outgroup hate, and specific political violence, are all essentially ad hoc measures justified by citation density rather than measurement history or theory. Just because he cites other people's work doesn't make his made-up questions valid. That imbalance weakens Piazza's whole chain of his argument because the weakest parts of his entire study are doing the most important work. Third, Piazza keeps treating the assumption that the questions seem to be similar as if it means the questions measure the right thing. But there is a huge difference. A high reliability score only tells us that the items are scored similarly, like ice cream sales and outside temperature, not that they actually mean the same thing. Fourth, several of Piazza's measures conflate attitudes, grievances, and moral judgments under single labels. For example, outgroup hate is operationalized as resentment toward minority rights. Incel beliefs mix descriptive claims, moral entitlement, nostalgia, and grievance into one summed score. And that's where testing would tear it apart. To amateurs like James, all of those may be conceptually interesting groups, but they are not clean concepts, and he treats them as if they are. Fifth, his research leans heavily on scale borrowing as intellectual cover, not as professional rigor. Although he cites other authors correctly by theory in his untested measures, they are partially repurposed, they're combined, or entirely made up and untested. I'll stop short of calling that misconduct, but it is low-level methodological work, and it should never be published. Put bluntly, this is the kind of measurement package I would accept from a strong undergraduate capstone or maybe a first-year graduate student who understands theory, maybe they read widely, and they can execute simple regression models. The problem is that the confidence of Piazza's conclusions far exceed the maturity of the measurement in his work. A good psychologist or any other researcher in any field would either A, scale back on the claims dramatically, or B, spend another year developing and validating the measures before using them and publishing them. Methodologically, Piazza's paper reads like someone who knows what to measure and has political knowledge, but hasn't yet done the kind of slow, painful work that separates publishable social science work from durable psychological science. Now let's discuss why this is such a big problem for men and how academia portrays them. Publishing work like Piazza's in a top-tier outlet such as Taylor and Francis creates real downstream problems that go well beyond this paper. When methodologically weak measures are laundered through a prestigious journal like this, they acquire borrowed authority, meaning that later researchers, journalists, and policymakers treat the research with authority simply because of where it appeared, not how well the work was done. That in turn encourages citation cascades in which weak or untested measures get reused, rebranded, and stacked into meta-analyses, which in turn, downstream, slowly turns biased ideas into so-called facts without ever having passed serious validation. Listen, the danger is amplified when the topic carries moral urgency and policy relevance, such as this one does. Claims about political violence, extremism, and public safety are especially vulnerable to overreach, especially in today's climate. Because liberal organizations such as universities and nonprofit organizations and institutions, they are eager for quick narratives and confident assertions regardless of the quality of the research. And once such findings from junk research like this enter policy discussions, the nuance and measurement caveats completely disappear. So to be clear, assertions like this shape surveillance priorities, intervention programs, and public discourse in ways that are difficult to untwist later. Once it's in the news, it's a headline, and that's all people care about. Right? It's just like getting a headline without actually understanding the issue and the full story. At a professional level, this reflects a failure of editorial and review standards that research publishers have come to embrace, and it's become a huge problem in academia. Just think, hundreds of thousands of research articles are published every year, and the largest and what should be the most reputable journals are doing this. They're approving articles like this one. High-impact journals are supposed to act as quality filters, not accelerants. Listen, there is a lot of money in the research publishing industry. That's a topic that maybe I'll dive into another day. But for now, as I close, when journals publish work that is exploratory, but is approved and passed off as explanatory, like we see here, they blur the line between ideology and evidence, which degrades trust in the whole and literature as a whole. Over time, this contributes to a research ecosystem in which prestige substitutes for rigor and wherein acuity becomes politically motivated rather than intellectually routine. So, that's the story, my friends. Thanks for sticking to the end, and be sure to leave your thoughts in a comment. I'll see you soon.